Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Wednesday, October 30th, 2019. Now, recently I have heard more and more from grassroots groups, activists, and the like about efforts to create, and even in the news, efforts to create Second Amendment sanctuary cities all over the place. I've seen some efforts in Texas, in New Mexico, in Colorado, or Oregon, actually, and in Illinois. But almost every single one that I've taken a look at, and I've looked pretty closely, has one or two fatal flaws that renders them almost totally useless in practice. Now, I don't actually oppose even the ones with the fatal flaws, but only oppose them if they're presented to people as being an actual gun rights sanctuary, when in fact they really are not. It's not an easy subject, and I'm going to do my best to explain this to you today, and hopefully you can use this, especially if this is an issue that's important to you, or if you see some reports about it, or you hear people talking about it in your area. This is something that you can use as a kind of a reference guide, along with the links in the show notes that I'll be publishing a half hour to an hour after this broadcast is done, for people to be able to read and learn how to do this in a very effective manner. First of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We're broadcasting live as we do every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We have our live video streams through YouTube, Facebook, DLive, Twitch, and Periscope / Twitter. Plus, we also have archived video versions at Brighteon.com and BitChute. I think we're also posting to BitTubers, which used to be bit.tube. It's a kind of a somewhat decentralized, kind of a crypto-based platform as well there. We'll see how well that one plays out. And we do have the audio-only podcast editions, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Google, and elsewhere. I'm very grateful for all the podcast reviews that have been coming in. It is definitely increasing our reach, and our stats are going up consistently, slowly but consistently. So thank you, everyone, whether it's the video, the audio, archive, or live. All of the feedback, the comments, the sharing, all of that really helps a lot. Thank you very much. All of those archives, by the way, are over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. That's also where you're going to find the links that I'll reference in this episode as well. But first of all, before getting to that, let's take a look over in the live chat. I appreciate everyone who is here with me today. I took a day off on Monday. It was my 16-year anniversary with my lovely Sarah, and I had a really long weekend, an awesome one, speaking at the annual Mises Supporters Summit with Tom Woods, Lou Rockwell, Jeff Deist. David Gordon was there. A lot of really cool things happening. That was really, really amazing to be a part of it. I'm assuming they're going to have video of all the speeches, including my own, over up on YouTube pretty soon. I saw that they included a podcast edition over at Mises.org this week already, so you can check out the website there if you want to catch up. Anyways, hi to Justin Bayola, Alton Smith, Tyler B., Dan Reed. Happy days late anniversary. Thank you. I appreciate you guys all joining me. And again, whether it's live or in the archive, feel free to continue to leave some comments. I do read them all. I don't get a chance to reply to everyone every single time, but your feedback means a lot to me. And of course, if you have suggestions for episodes that you'd like me to or topics you'd like me to cover in future episodes, the email that you can send to is team@10thamendmentcenter.com. And thank you as well to Justin. I appreciate that. Anyways, let's get to this. So first of all, I think it's important to generally understand what qualifies as a sanctuary city. And if we're talking on the immigration end of things, there is some variance, but as a general rule of thumb, most of these jurisdictions refuse to participate in the enforcement of a particular or a broad range of federal laws, and thereby rendering the federal government resource deficient, and then they can't actually get the so-called or the federal law enforced. Some jurisdictions actually take it a little bit further than that. Most of them do not. We'll see how that plays out in the future, and maybe we need to readdress that. But for the purposes of the strategy of this in regards to Second Amendment or gun rights sanctuaries, let's focus on that particularly. The refusal to participate in the enforcement of, let's say, federal gun control measures like the National Firearms Act of 1934, the Gun Control Act of 1968, its amendments in 1986, and I believe like the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988, the new bump stock ban that was implemented by the Trump administration last Christmas. Merry Christmas, Mr. and Mrs. American. Turn them all in. But all of that. So that is the most common situation. Now, gun rights supporters, we are starting to see them trying to do the right thing. But I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in how this strategy plays out. Unfortunately, the right conservatives and Republicans have really not used this strategy like they should, which is odd because we see so much reverence for the Constitution and the founders. And this type of strategy is literally based on the verbatim words of James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution himself. So you can't actually say, I love the founders or the advice of the founders or I want to restore the Constitution and then literally just flat out ignore what the father of the Constitution himself said to do. So let's look at that first. This is actually based, and I know I've covered this a bunch of times on the show, so I'm just going to briefly mention a couple of foundational pieces here, where the strategy comes from, why it's effective. Why it's effective really is that the federal government is involved in everything. It tells us how big our toilet can be, what type of plants we can grow, what kind of light bulbs we have. Maybe they don't do that as much as they used to. When we have to fight and die for them, whether or not we can defend ourselves with our natural right to keep and bear arms. It does so much that it doesn't have the resources to implement its own regulatory or programs or so-called laws. And I put laws in quotes because most of what the feds do shouldn't be done in the first place. But this is based on James Madison's advice in Federalist 46. And let me just pull this up again. This link will be in the show notes. It's an article. We've got a number of versions of this article, but this was from December 15th, 2016. And in Federalist 46, Madison was talking about concerns that people were having that the new central government under the proposed Constitution would swallow up federalism, would destroy the power of the states or the people of the states, and destroy liberty. Well, Madison said, well, as long as you just do these four particular things, none of which included voting the bums out or suing the feds in federal court, but if you do these four things in a number of states, he said it would, quote, present obstructions which the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. In other words, even at a time when the federal government was tiny compared to today, we know that Jefferson wanted to cut back on the size of federal employees when it was just in the hundreds. So it was tiny, but even at that point, merely refusing to participate in the enforcement of federal programs would present obstructions which the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter, according to James Madison. And his words, he said, the means of opposition to the federal government are powerful and at hand. The disquietude of the people, their repugnance, and perhaps refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Madison's words, refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. If you want to read that in more detail, it explains this whole part of Federalist 46 in more detail, but it's very, very good stuff. And you will understand why Madison talked about that as well. But then, surprisingly enough, and even though I don't base my decisions on what is constitutional or not, what is good or bad, what is positive for liberty or not, based on what the Supreme Court says. Until then, the Supreme Court changes its mind and then says something different. So my view of the Constitution is based on what the founders and the drafters gave us from the Philadelphia Convention, how it was explained by both the proponents in conjunction with the opposition, and then what the ratifiers, the people of the several states, considered it to be, what gave it legal force. These are the people who gave it legal force. So their view, the ratifiers, are really the controlling force of what the Constitution means. So whatever the Supreme Court happens to say today means very little to me based on the Constitution. Sometimes the Supreme Court gets it right. Sometimes it gets it wrong. In most cases, it doesn't even get it at all. It doesn't even touch on most things that the federal government does because the federal government has passed tens of thousands or thousands upon thousands of acts and regulatory programs and regulations that the Supreme Court doesn't even consider most of them. So to say that the Constitution means what the Supreme Court says it means is totally counter to what the Constitution actually was set up to be. So Madison said, refuse to cooperate with officers of the Union. Surprisingly, the Supreme Court has gotten this right over and over and over when challenged. In a series of 5 major cases from 1842 to 2017, they have reaffirmed what's called the anti-commandeering doctrine. That is, that the federal government cannot require states to use resources or personnel to enforce or effectuate federal acts or regulatory programs. I did an entire episode on this back in February of 2019 of this year. I'll have the link to that in the show notes. It's called Anti-commandeering, the legal basis for refusing to cooperate. And the reason that this is so important is because most legislation to undermine federal program by refusing to participate, whether it's on cannabis prohibition enforcement or gun prohibition enforcement, goes through lawyers at whatever level, whether it's in a state legislature or on a city council. Lawyers look at it and then they attack it. But if you can base it on something, not just on James Madison, because these lawyer people don't care about the founders. They don't study the founding. They only study Supreme Court precedent. They think that the Constitution, the rule of law started in 1803, and whatever the Supreme Court has said since then is what the law is or what the Constitution is. So they don't really care that James Madison told us in Federalist 46 to refuse to cooperate with officers of the Union in multiple states as an effective method to stop federal programs. So they care about the Supreme Court. And that's why the anti-commandeering doctrine is so important and has helped us be so effective in our 10th Amendment and nullification activism on a state and local level, because we could just go to them and say, look, the Supreme Court agrees with us. I mean, 99% of the time they don't, but thankfully on this they do, and they've been very consistent. There have been 5 major cases. We can go all the way back to 1842, the Prigg versus Pennsylvania case. I'm not going to talk about these all. I believe I also did another episode. Well, that was the episode that I was just mentioning. But you can also read through this if you prefer to do that rather than actually, well, watching me talk for another 30, 40 minutes. But there's a full article that I'll link in the show notes that gives an overview of each of these cases. The most recent one was literally just last year. 1 year ago, well, a year and a half maybe. The Murphy versus NCAA case in 2018. This is the New Jersey sports betting case for those of you who are watching the Supreme Court. And in short, check this out from Mike Meharry. He writes, the court held that Congress can't take any action that, and this is what Samuel Alito wrote, any action that dictates what a state legislature may or may not do. They can't say that Congress or that a state legislature or state government can do this, and they cannot tell them that they have to do that or they can't do that. Even when that state action directly conflicts with federal law on the books, they still have to hold the position that if the feds want to pass something, they shouldn't be involved in so much stuff that they don't have the manpower or the resources to do this, and they can't rely on the states to do it for them. But because the feds are all around the world involved in everybody's business here at home and overseas, they don't have the resources to enforce almost anything. The federal government may not do anything to tell a state legislature may or may not do. And he put it this way, quote, a more direct affront to state sovereignty is not easy to imagine. That's the most recent application of this. We also have the Prince case, which is Richard Mack and Jay Prince, the sheriffs that sued the Bill Clinton administration over enforcement of the Brady Act. They were trying to get local sheriffs to help implement the federal gun control program. And I think that, well, maybe I'll look at that one as well, because I think that one actually ties in so closely. And they were trying to get at provision, this is what Mike wrote, at provision in 1997, at issue was a provision in the Brady gun control bill that required county law enforcement officers to administer part of the background check program. Sheriffs Jay Prince and Richard Mack sued, and Sheriff Mack today runs CSPOA, Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, where he encourages sheriffs to stop enforcing these types of federal acts. They argued that these provisions were unconstitutional because it forced them to administer a federal program. Justice Scalia agreed, writing in the majority opinion, quote, it is apparent that the Brady Act purports to direct state law enforcement orders to participate, albeit only temporarily, in the administration of a federally enacted regulatory scheme. He says, today we hold that Congress cannot circumvent a prohibition on compelling states to enact, enforce, or enforce a regulatory program from a previous case by conscripting the state's officers directly. The federal government cannot, according to Justice Scalia's opinion in 97, cannot conscript the states directly. The federal government may neither issue directives requiring the states to address particular problems, nor command the state's officers or those of their political subdivisions to administer or enforce a federal regulatory program. It matters not whether policy making is involved, and no case-by-case weighing of the burdens or benefits is necessary. Such commands are fundamentally incompatible with our constitutional system of dual sovereignty. I can take issue with a little bit of that. In the American system, only the people of the several states are sovereign. I know they like to actually put that sovereignty or final authority on government, but that's really the British system. No government in the American system under the Constitution is real sovereign. This is just, I guess, a shorthand way of putting it. But the short version that Scalia said in that case is that no, local officers, local government agents, states could not be required, including their political subdivisions, which are cities, counties, and the like, towns, cannot be required to help the federal government implement any federal act or regulatory program. Period. Now, there are two fatal flaws in how most people are actually trying to use this strategy, which has been used on many other things, primarily on the left end of the political spectrum for a long time. Of course, immigration is a big one, and people, I think, are starting to recognize that, like, whoa, these immigration sanctuary cities, even if you disagree with them, you can still recognize that they're obviously doing something incredibly effective at undermining federal programs. So why not do this? Put your energy into something that you love, your right to keep and bear arms. And we are starting to see some movement on this. And I think that part is positive. But there are two huge fatal flaws that most legislation or local ordinances and resolutions make in the actual text of the legislation. And I'm not going to get too detailed about the nitty-gritty of the legislation, but I will cover some examples in Illinois and Oregon in just a couple of minutes. First of all, the relationship between their misunderstanding, the relationship between states and the federal government on one hand, and on the other hand, the relationship between local government units, cities, counties, towns, and state governments. In the former, the states, the people of the several states, created the federal government. The federal government is the creature, not the creator, not the other way around. So the people of the several states created the federal government, not the other way around. I think Reagan actually even talked about that some years ago. The latter, the cities, the localities, they're called political subdivisions. It's totally opposite. Even in states where there is home rule, where there is a lot of autonomy on the local level, the political subdivisions, that's why they call them that. And in fact, the Hamiltonian view of the national government, the original actual James Madison plan in the Virginia plan that he proposed at the Philadelphia Convention before he decided to go along to get along, was to create a national government where, in essence, this is more Hamilton than anything, but in essence, and James Wilson probably too, they wanted the states to be merely political subdivisions of the central government, where the central government had total national authority over everything. Instead, they created a federal model where there's this, what Scalia called dual sovereignty, where each area had responsibility in its own sphere, and Madison described it in Federalist 45, the one right before this, that the powers delegated to the federal government to the proposed government under the proposed Constitution are few and defined. Those reserved to the states are numerous and indefinite. So there's far more that's supposed to be done on a state or a local level, if at all, but it's up to the people of each state to make that determination. So, but the relationship between cities and states is not the same. The cities didn't come first. And in fact, the name political subdivision tells us that the cities or even counties exist as a creature of the state government. And in many places, and I'm going to give you an example here in a moment, when a city or a state or city does things that the state government doesn't like, the state government can heavily punish that city, can remove people from office, can even close down the city completely if they wanted to. It's not something we see happen very often, but it exists. So, for example, let me pull this up here again. In Florida, just recently, I wonder when this was published. I think this was just in the last month or so. Florida Senate endorses Governor Ron DeSantis, removes Scott Israel as Broward County Sheriff. And here from the report in the Sun Sentinel, after hours of debate filled with gripping emotional details about the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas massacre and soaring rhetoric about constitutional rights and the weighty responsibilities of elected officials, the Florida Senate voted Wednesday to remove suspended Broward Sheriff Scott Israel. It was a 25-15 vote. So what does that tell you? The sheriff is not autonomous from the state government. So if the sheriff decides to do something that the governor finds awful, or for whatever reason, maybe the governor wants to make a political stand, whatever, the governor in Florida was able to suspend. Now, there may be some restrictions as to under what circumstances. I haven't looked into the Florida law. Maybe Andrew Nappy or somebody is out there that can give me some insight on how that actually plays out. But the governor suspended a sheriff. The president cannot ever. There is zero circumstance where the president could suspend a sheriff or a mayor or a governor, because these are independent from the federal government. The federal government has zero delegated authority. The federal government did not create those states, which then in turn created the local government. So the federal government has no say over that. Even though there was a proposal, mind you, the Virginia plan, there was a proposal to give the federal government veto power over every act of the states. But that was rejected by the Philadelphia Convention, so we know for a fact that the founders did not want this to be the system on the national level. But however, on the state level, it absolutely is it. So this took the governor suspending this sheriff. The sheriff was then, by a vote of the Senate, maybe it went through the House first, but it was removed along with a vote from the legislature. So here's this could happen to every sheriff in Florida. It probably would not be politically popular, but it can, because that's the legal structure. And here in the Florida statutes, they can actually dissolve the charter of a municipal government. So a city, a county, could just be wiped from the map. I mean, it would still exist, but it wouldn't have any governing authority. This is basically what King George, and we can argue whether or not this is good power or bad power to have. I actually prefer more decentralization all the time, but under the Constitution of each state, this is how it's structured. This is what the King of England did to the New York Assembly when in 1767 and 1768, the Townshend Acts and then the response to them by John Dickinson, one of those was the New York Restraining Act. The king didn't like how New York was not participating in things, so he restrained the legislature, the assembly of the colony of New York, and said they couldn't exist. Basically just said you're done. But this is what the state of Florida could do as well. As an example, here it is in their state code 165.051, dissolution procedures. The charter of any existing municipality may be revoked and the municipal corporation dissolved by either a special act of the legislature. So the state legislature could say, Miami, you're done. We're taking over. Or B, an ordinance of the governing body of the municipality approved by the vote of qualified voters. So cities can be dissolved, but they act under the will and the approval of the state government. So that is one fatal flaw, and people tend to confuse that. And so what they end up doing in legislation, they want to stop all gun control measures, as do I. I think all gun control is a restriction on your natural right to keep and bear arms. I will briefly point out this is not a Second Amendment right. Your Second Amendment is not your permit. Your humanity, your cells, your DNA, your existence, your soul, whatever, that is your gun permit. You do not need permission from any one government, not from an amendment, not from a constitution, not from D.C., not from your state, even though every act of these governments is restricting on that. So if we have that proper philosophical foundation, that's important. But then, of course, it's pretty easy to look all around and say, yeah, there are tons of really bad stuff. In Florida, the red flag laws, we're seeing calls for more gun control in Texas. I mean, if they're going to do it in Texas, can you imagine how bad it's going to get here in California? It's already bad on gun control in California to the point where professionals have told me don't even carry a taser because the cops might shoot you. They're not used to seeing people carry anything. So it's a very dangerous situation. It's going to get significantly worse as the so-called right to keep and bear arms party, the Republicans, even on the state and local level, are caving on this stuff. So where was I going with that? So, okay, of course, you're looking around and you're thinking, well, if we want to create a gun rights sanctuary or a Second Amendment sanctuary, which is really the wrong term, but let's say we're talking about a gun rights sanctuary city, there's a lot of gun control on the books from my state capital. That's absolutely junk. That needs to be stopped too. So the problem is that the legislation tends to combine it all at one. 2 points there. One, the more that you try to do with one piece of legislation, the less likely it is to pass. This happens across the board no matter what the issue. But two, if you combine the practical impact of how this stuff is enforced or who gets to do what to what municipality, then if a state court strikes something down saying, well, let's say a local government in Texas tells Austin, well, we're not going to enforce your gun control. But in the same line, it tells D.C., we're not going to enforce your gun control either. Well, the state government might tell that local government, well, we're not going to allow you to do that. And then maybe some courts might strike that down, and then down the tube goes the resistance to the federal act. So basically what you need to do, short version, is every piece of legislation has different sections. Some areas they're letters, some areas they're numbers, sometimes they have code, whatever it may be. You just need to put the refusal to participate in the various gun control measures in different sections. You address federal in one section and state in another section, and at the end you include a severability clause just in case some courts say, well, we're not going to allow this, and then the local government caves because they believe that they have to follow the will of the court instead of actually doing what they should be doing, which is the right thing no matter what the courts say, and they just cave, then they only take apart one of it. And that is a very good strategic move, is to actually just literally put these in two different sections of the same legislation or address them in totally different pieces of legislation. Hopefully this makes sense. Now, the second fatal flaw that I think is more important, and I'll cover here in a little bit more detail, is that most of the legislation that's being proposed and passed actually does nothing. It does almost nothing in practice. And while I do support making philosophical statements, even through legislation, non-binding resolutions, for example, back when our organization started, we're going into our 14th year now. We started back in 2006, really started getting active through 2007. Most of the 10th Amendment movement at that time, the attention was on non-binding resolutions passed by states, reaffirming sovereignty is the way they put it in these resolutions, under the 10th Amendment, reaffirming the Constitution, demanding that the federal government stop violating the Constitution. And even though none of those had any effect, as long as they weren't sold as having that effect, people in the grassroots recognized that follow-up steps needed to be taken. Unfortunately, though, a lot of the same thing happening for gun rights sanctuaries, or attempts to do that, are selling them as being the same as immigration sanctuary cities, which are clearly having an effect, when the legislation in the gun sanctuaries will have almost none, at least in the immediate term. They could be used as, look, this is a foundational starting point. Let's get this on the books. We have follow-up work to do. We've got a lot of work to do. There's gun control for the last nearly 100 years that needs to be stopped. Let's just get something on the board. Let's get the ball rolling. Let's run with it. Let's fight for our rights, take a stand, and the like. If it's sold like that, to me, that's very positive. But unfortunately, that's not what's actually happening. I wrote an article. I was contacted by NBC News sometime early last year talking about these efforts for primarily in Illinois and Oregon. And the NBC News reporter was pretty surprised at what I had to say about it. And I wrote an article covering basically that whole process. Let me pull this up. Most recent gun rights sanctuary counties are anything but. And I pointed out here in the article, USA Today, SHTF Plan, TF Plan, Associated Press, CNN, Fox News, Bearing Arms, and many others have all referred to these efforts as gun sanctuary resolutions. They're calling them gun rights sanctuaries. They're telling people that the resolutions passed are similar in practice and strategy as immigration sanctuary cities. Brian Kibler, the top prosecutor of Effingham County, Illinois, told Fox News that the resolutions passed aren't much different from cities such as Chicago, which refuse to cooperate with federal immigration authorities. But he's wrong. So they're telling people, hey, we're passing this resolution, and we're doing the same thing that these immigration sanctuary cities are, but they're not. And let's clear this up. The key phrase is directive versus statement. Anytime you hear the word resolution, except in, for example, some counties in Kansas, most situations when a local governing body passes a resolution, it is a statement of opinion. A resolution is generally a non-binding philosophical statement about a goal of a legislative body. An ordinance on a local level is a law, a binding law, and a directive. So, for example, we have a model ordinance, a Second Amendment preservation ordinance. It should be called a gun rights sanctuary ordinance at this point. I'll probably take a look at it and update it pretty soon. But it, first of all, declares all federal gun laws unconstitutional. And then based on that declaration, it bans the locality from helping enforce or effectuate any such violations. No agent, employee, or official of whatever city, county, or town, or any corporation providing services to that city, county, or town shall provide material support or participate in any way with the implementation of federal acts, orders, rules, laws, or regulations in violation of the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Now, mind you, some people have just lifted that part, and then they try to pass something, and if it passes, then the response by law enforcement is, yeah, absolutely. We will not enforce something that violates the Second Amendment of the Constitution. You go ahead and create a lawsuit, and when the court tells us that this is unconstitutional, we'll stop enforcing it. And that's why we include in the definitions what is considered a violation of the Second Amendment. And maybe we'll make it a little bit more clear because that tends to be somewhat confusing even to some local legislators, but this is a very customary way of drafting the legislation. You define what is considered a violation of the Constitution. We say all federal acts, laws, orders, rules, or regulations regarding firearms, accessories, and ammunition. Everything. Unconstitutional, and because those are unconstitutional, the locality will not use any resources to enforce or effectuate those federal acts. And I go on in the article. In short, passage of this ordinance immediately changes how local resources are used and bans all government agencies, including police, from participating in the enforcement of any federal gun control measures. It's a directive to law enforcement, not a statement of principles or a request. On the other hand, the so-called gun rights sanctuary resolution passed in Effingham, where that attorney there is telling us it's the same as the Chicago immigration sanctuary, which is just either it's political grandstanding, the guy's an idiot, or he's a liar. I'm not sure. Maybe it's a combination. But this resolution passed where this guy's claiming it's the same as Chicago includes no immediate directive for law enforcement to start or stop doing anything whatsoever. It does not actually tell law enforcement to stop enforcing any gun control, state or federal, period. Instead, it includes two demands. First, it demands that the Illinois General Assembly cease further actions restricting the right of the people to keep and bear arms. That's a good demand. It is good to pass something like that. If that's all you can get passed, it is probably good to do that. But if you sell it as being something beyond what it is, you're a scam artist. You're probably just trying to get votes. I don't know how else to put it. Second, it tells the governor to veto all such legislation which restricts the right of the people to keep and bear arms. All it is just literally saying we take the position and we are supporting the right to keep and bear arms. We support the Second Amendment, and we demand that the Illinois government stop doing something that we know they're never going to stop doing. There is no directive to law enforcement to stop participating in that. They may have a difficult time getting away with that in Illinois, but they should at least try rather than pretend they're doing something that they're not. Now, after the demand, I write, comes an attempt at a directive, but it includes a caveat so big that it renders the resolution ineffective in practice. And this is what I was talking about before. It says, if the government of the state of Illinois shall infringe upon the inalienable rights granted by the Second Amendment. I should just break this down. First of all, it says, if the government shall infringe upon these rights. We know the Illinois government is violating that natural right to keep and bear arms constantly. There's no if. So get rid of the if. Change it to the governor. The government of the state of Illinois is infringing on our right to keep and bear arms. Also, those inalienable rights are not granted by the Second Amendment. If the Second Amendment ends up being repealed at some point in the future, and there are a lot of people who want to do that, and they'll get it through a convention or whatever it may be, whatever approach, there's a lot of people who want to get rid of the Second Amendment, not just in practice, but in reality. You still have a natural right, and then that renders all this stuff ineffective. No founder would ever say your rights are granted by the document. Why did we keep getting stuff like this? There is no such thing as a Second Amendment right. So if the government is, if it happens, if it's granted by the Second Amendment, then Effington County shall become a sanctuary county for all firearms unconstitutionally prohibited by the government of the state of Illinois, in that Effingham County will prohibit its employees from enforcing the unconstitutional acts of the state government. Short version of all that mumbo-jumbo to look tough and look good and look like they're protecting the right to keep and bear arms is the so-called gun rights sanctuary resolution passed in Effingham County and a number of other localities that are following their lead now, using the same language verbatim. They're literally saying, if a court tells us that what the state is doing violates our right to keep and bear arms, then we're not going to enforce that. This couldn't be more worthless. Period. And then, of course, it doesn't address federal gun control at all. As if all these gun control measures on the books are somehow, they don't matter. No point at all. So that's a very important part of it. If you're going to pass a resolution, just say it's a resolution. If you're just making a statement or a demand, call a demand. John Dickinson specifically, this is the penman of the revolution, urged the colonies to pass non-binding resolutions like what we're talking about here in response to the Townshend Acts of 1767. His statement in response to that was, in short, if Parliament or the King can lawfully deprive New York of any of her rights, then it can deprive any of the other colonies of their rights. So at this stage, even if you're not going to take a further stand, the proper role is to just literally make a statement, rally people to the cause, and then figure out what's next. So if all you can get passed in Illinois, which is probably pretty likely, is a statement like this, which I think would be positive, just sell it at that. Don't tell people that you're creating a sanctuary, because you're giving people a false message on what they're getting when they're going into your town. But absolutely, at this point, even after passage of this, every law enforcement agency, except up to individual discretion of the law enforcement agents, will continue to arrest you for violating any of these so-called gun control measures from the government of the state of Illinois. They will also continue to help the federal government, which almost every locality does all the time, enforce all the federal gun control measures. So nothing has changed on the ground. I'm sorry to ramble on this so much, but it's so important. Going on, we have the ordinances passed in Oregon, Second Amendment preservation ordinances, for example, in Coos County, Oregon in 2015. And check this out. After a series of whereas clauses, which are merely statements of intent or finding without legal effect, the enacting clause start with, therefore do ordain. They provide no directive to end enforcement of any gun law, state or federal. They literally do the exact same thing. They pass an ordinance, so it's now a law rather than just a non-binding resolution. But in that law, it says any regulation of the right to keep and bear arms that violate the 2nd, 9th, 10th, or 14th Amendment or the state constitution, which I'm glad they included the sections of the state constitution, shall be regarded by the people on and in Coos County as unconstitutional, a transgression of the supreme law of the land and its spirit of liberty, and thereby by necessity void ab initio. So, yes, if a court, again, says that this is a violation of any of these amendments because they don't include a definition of what qualifies as that. They don't actually say that all gun control measures on the books are a violation. They're just leaving it open-ended. Anything that violates that is void. Well, then the question has been, well, we got to wait for someone to tell us that that's a violation. So in practice, even though in theory it sounds great, in practice, zero changes. And this is how I put it in that article. In short, the ordinance voters passed in Coos County in 2015 says that if a regulation of the right to keep and bear arms is deemed a violation of the Constitution, the people of Coos County will regard it as unconstitutional. Wow. That is not a sanctuary city. The ordinance then includes a directive of sorts to end enforcement. You can read it. But basically they're saying, if someone else tells us it's unconstitutional, we'll stop enforcing it. This is not a very, very strong approach at all. Now, in that same article, I compared these type of ordinances with the kind of the granddaddy of the immigration sanctuaries, and you can look at the San Francisco. You could just Google the San Francisco immigration ordinance and read it for yourself. I should just put a link to it. I don't have it here for my prep for the show today, but I will try to put that in the show notes as well. Just read the San Francisco ordinance and you'll notice a big difference. They never say things like, if something is determined to be unconstitutional, we'll stop participating. They literally just have the backbone and say, you guys are not going to help the feds on this area of immigration, this area of immigration law, this area of this. And they don't even think, I mean, it's important to think about the constitutionality, but they're not waiting for someone else to give them approval. And that's where they are way more strong. They have way more backbone than any of these efforts on the right to keep and bear arms. They're pussyfooting around this stuff so much. They're just hoping that someone else will strike it down so they don't actually have to take a stand, or maybe they're just grandstanding for votes. Now, in November of last year, a number of counties in Oregon took it a little bit further, creating, and this is another article that we published on this, Mike Meharry did this, Oregon counties, 8 counties in Oregon set the foundation for gun rights sanctuary counties. They were much better, but still had another fatal flaw, very similar. It didn't actually do anything in practice. So they require, so for example, this one looks very closely, they're all basically the same. This one, Douglas County in Oregon, would require the sheriff to determine whether any federal, state, or local laws and regulations relating to firearms, accessories, or ammunition violate the U.S. or Oregon Constitution. Any law or regulation the sheriff deemed unconstitutional would be unenforceable. Again, instead of taking the San Francisco approach and literally saying the city government is telling law enforcement no longer participating. You're no longer participating. In Oregon, they're telling the law enforcement, hey, if you don't think that you should enforce this, don't. It's cool. That's positive. That sets the foundation. But in practice, most of the sheriffs tell us that's not my job to determine constitutionality. I mean, it is. That's why CSPOA is so helpful. They should actually be thinking about the Constitution because they take an oath to the Constitution, and they should only do things that follow that oath. They take an oath to the state and federal constitutions, and they should be thinking about that. They should not participate in stuff. And this, I do, again, think it's positive. But in practice, no one's doing anything differently. Or if it is in such small numbers that it's not really having any real impact. So once deemed unconstitutional, Mike writes, the ordinance would prohibit the counties from authorizing the use of funds, resources, employees, agencies, contractors, buildings, detention centers, or offices for the purpose of enforcing such laws. So instead of waiting for someone else, again, kicking the can down the road, and saying, well, this person has to do it, and then hopefully this person stays in office and actually follows through and then doesn't get voted out and put in by somebody else who takes a completely different approach. Instead, it should just be put in city code, in the ordinance. Look, No more are we going to participate in enforcement of these acts. This is just something how the city is going to decide to use its resources, or the county, whatever it may be. We're going to stop participating. So in summary, and this has been a pretty long episode, but I hope you guys found it interesting. I think it's something that's incredibly important to cover. Two things really need to happen to create an effective gun rights sanctuary city movement. I think, first of all, state and federal legislation dealing with state and federal gun control should be addressed in separate legislation. That is really the best way to approach it. For those that really want to try to combine and get everything done at once, it has to be addressed in separate sections with a severability clause. For those of you who want to geek out on it, you can email me if you've got questions about this. team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Separate sections with a directive to stop enforcing federal gun control in one section, and then another section with the directive to stop enforcing state gun control. And then a severability clause in case somebody figures out a way to take people to court and strike part of it down. They absolutely will not be able to strike down the part banning enforcement of federal gun control. In some areas, the state level part is at risk. Now, even if it gets struck down by the state courts, I would encourage people to continue standing up for their rights. But unfortunately, most government actors will not participate like that. So that's why it's so important to separate those in the legislation. And then the second thing that they really need to do is stop kicking the can down the road. Stop saying if the gun control measures violate our rights, thereby creating a scenario where it's waiting for a court to say, yeah, okay, that thing that they've been doing, you don't have to help them anymore. Stop kicking the can down the road, whether to a court or to a sheriff or to anybody, and literally just end the practice of enforcing these gun control measures, state, federal, all of it. And I think rather than waiting for someone to say that it's okay to be free, this is part of a process where people need to learn how to exercise their rights, whether government wants them to or not. Now, I'm sure I am way behind on the live chat. Richard Kramer, wording is everything. Brian Cox, there are 23 million Americans who've been stripped of their rights, second-class citizens for rights. Oh, that's for ex-felons. Yes, true. And if you think about it, so many of the laws that people, Brian makes a great point here. So many of the felonies that people get shouldn't even be laws in the first place. All the nonviolent criminal acts, these are used as a wedge to restrict people's right to defend themselves as well. Calvin, good morning, everyone. Just a little bit late. Frank Alonzo, good to see you, buddy. There's a pastor, Tim Thompson in Riverside County, who is advocating for sanctuary schools. I have not heard of this. If you, Frank, if you want to send me a message and get me rolling on it, you can Facebook message me. I would love to hear from you. Liberty Freeman, appreciate your feedback. EHP training, hi to you as well. And again, I think I'm way behind on the live chat here. I can't even make sense. There's a lot of really interesting back and forth, and I appreciate that. Matthew Butts, Dennis Marburger, Jared Peace, and the like. Anyways, I'm so grateful for you spending some time with me today. I hope you found it interesting. More importantly, I hope you learned something. This is not easy to digest stuff, but I think it's really important because not only is our work here at the 10th Amendment Center focused on educating people on proper philosophy, the foundation of government under the Constitution, but really more importantly than that, we can talk, but if we're not taking actions to actually advance liberty, we're wasting our time. I am not trying to educate people on things just to talk about things so we can complain about it on social media. I want to create a scenario, and we do this quite a bit, especially when the state legislatures are in session primarily in the early part of the year. We call it nullification season. We want to find strategic ways to undermine federal programs as much as possible. And then from there, we can see about the states. But this is way, way down the line. Things are so bad. It's going to take a very strong strategy, a really effective one. We see it playing out on a number of issues. I would like to see it, and I've been talking about this for a number of years. I would like to see gun rights activists start to push forward on state, local action, individual resistance, like we see on the effort to ban bump stocks, where in the first period of turning these in, we know from a Freedom of Information Act request from the Washington Times, only 582 of these devices out of about up to 500,000 of them were turned into the ATF. I know that's not a done story, but the numbers are so low, it suggests to me that people are willing to defy. So that is an important piece of the puzzle as well. We've got to include jury nullification, but all of these pieces make for a very strong strategy, and we have to avoid the pitfalls of passing legislation that does nothing. If it does nothing, talk about it as doing nothing. And in this report, the last one that I covered about the 8 gun rights sanctuary county votes last fall, we talk about it as setting the foundation to create them. The foundation is there. Now, if the sheriff does the right thing, then you can actually have that happen. If the people follow up and amend this to change it from the sheriff decides to, look, we're telling the sheriff to stop, then it's there. But the foundation is set. Further action is required. I'm not sure if it's being pushed that way right now. I know the people behind this are fully on board with getting the job done, and they are facing a ton of pushback. They are aware, at least if there is a leadership. I know it's not really a leader type of a movement, but I've talked with some of the people up there, and I know they get this. So hopefully they have the long game in mind and will continue this march towards improving on what's on the books, and eventually we'll see as many gun rights sanctuaries, hundreds of them around the country, and then people could learn that other people exercising their rights does not bring the world to an end. Anyways, I'm so grateful for you spending some time with me today. Sorry to have missed it on Monday, but we'll be back on Friday and next week. If you enjoy the show, smash the like, subscribe. You can pitch in a couple of bucks a month, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We really need that help. So please, and I'm very grateful for everyone who has done so. If you're not able to, that's cool, but if you can, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed this. I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.